At 73 years old, I discovered that my husband had cheated on me during our honeymoon. He thought I was just a helpless little mouse. What I did with the photos from that trip made him beg for forgiveness on his knees in front of 200 guests. Listen to my story until the end and comment from which city you're watching me so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Margaret Rose, and I am 73 years old. Everything began when I was 25, a naive young woman who believed in fairy tales and happily ever after. I had just married the man I thought was the love of my life, Richard Henderson, a charming businessman who swept me off my feet with his smooth words and expensive gifts. Richard was everything I had dreamed of in a husband. He was tall, dark, and handsome, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through to my soul. He had a successful career in real estate development, drove a sleek black sedan, and always wore the finest suits. When he proposed to me after a whirlwind 6-month courtship, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. Our wedding was a grand affair, held at the prestigious Rosewood Manor. My parents, Harold and Evelyn Mitchell, spared no expense, even though my father worked as a humble bank clerk and my mother was a seamstress. They had saved for years, dreaming of the day their only daughter would walk down the aisle. The ceremony was attended by over 200 guests, including Richard's business associates and my childhood friends. My best friend since elementary school, Sarah Williams, was my maid of honor. She had always been protective of me, perhaps too protective at times. During the wedding preparations, she had expressed concerns about Richard's frequent business trips and the fact that he was often unreachable, but I was too blinded by love to listen to her warnings. The honeymoon was supposed to be the most magical 2 weeks of my life. Richard had planned an elaborate trip to a series of luxury resorts, each more beautiful than the last. We started at the Grand Palace Resort, a 5-star establishment nestled in the mountains, with breathtaking views and impeccable service. The suite Richard had booked was magnificent, with a king-sized bed adorned with silk sheets, a marble bathroom with a jacuzzi, and a private balcony overlooking the valley below. For the first few days, everything seemed perfect. Richard was attentive, romantic, and everything a new bride could wish for. We dined at the finest restaurants, took long walks through the resort's gardens, and spent hours making love like newlyweds should. But then the phone call started. It began on our 4th day at the Grand Palace. We were having breakfast on our balcony when Richard's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his expression changed subtly, becoming more serious and distant. "Sorry, darling," he said, standing up from the table. "It's work. I need to take this." He walked into the bedroom, closing the door behind him. I could hear his muffled voice through the walls, but couldn't make out the words. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, and when he returned, he seemed agitated and distracted. "Everything all right?" I asked, reaching for his hand. "Yes, of course," he replied, forcing a smile. "Just some issues with a property deal back home. Nothing for you to worry about, my love." The pattern continued throughout our honeymoon. Almost every day, sometimes twice a day, Richard would receive these mysterious work calls. Each time, he would excuse himself, speaking in hushed tones behind closed doors. When I asked about them, he would dismiss my concerns with vague explanations about urgent business matters and demanding clients. What troubled me most was how these calls seemed to energize him in a way that our romantic moments didn't. After each conversation, he would appear more alert, almost excited, though he tried to hide it. Sometimes I would catch him smiling to himself, a secretive smile that made my stomach twist with unease. We moved from the Grand Palace to the Ocean View Retreat, an exclusive beachfront resort where we had a villa right on the sand. The setting was incredibly romantic, with waves lapping at our doorstep and spectacular sunsets every evening. But the mysterious phone calls continued, now sometimes lasting up to an hour. During one such call at the Ocean View Retreat, I decided to investigate. While Richard was locked in the bathroom, supposedly dealing with another urgent work matter, I quietly picked up the extension phone in the bedroom. What I heard made my blood run cold. "I can't wait to see you again, sweetheart," Richard was saying in a voice I had never heard him use with me. Tender, intimate, loving in a way that cut through my heart like a knife. "I miss you too, Ricky," came a woman's voice, smooth and sultry. "This charade won't last much longer, will it?" "Just give me a few more months," Richard replied. "Once everything is settled, we can be together properly. The inheritance money will make everything possible." I hung up the phone as quietly as I could, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the receiver. Inheritance money? What inheritance money? My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had heard. The woman had called him Ricky, a pet name I had never used, never even heard anyone else use. For the remainder of our honeymoon, I played the part of the blissful new bride while inside I was dying. I watched Richard more carefully now, noticing things I had missed before. The way he would disappear for hours, claiming he was going to the gym or for a walk. The way he would return, smelling faintly of expensive perfume that wasn't mine. The way he would check his phone constantly, his fingers flying over the keys as he sent text messages he thought I couldn't see. Our final stop was the Sunset Paradise Resort, perhaps the most beautiful of all the places we visited. It was here that I made a discovery that would change everything. While Richard was having one of his work calls on the balcony, I decided to go through his belongings. Hidden in a zippered compartment of his suitcase, I found a second cell phone, one I had never seen before. My hands trembling, I scrolled through the messages. What I found there painted a picture of betrayal so complete, so calculated, that I felt physically sick. The phone contained hundreds of text messages between Richard and someone named Victoria. The messages went back over a year, long before Richard had even proposed to me. The texts revealed the truth in devastating detail. Victoria was Richard's former girlfriend, a woman he had never stopped loving. They had apparently broken up 2 years earlier, but had been secretly seeing each other all along. The messages showed that their relationship had continued throughout Richard's courtship of me, through our engagement, and even during our honeymoon. "Can't wait to hold you in my arms again, my real wife," read one message from Richard, sent just 2 days earlier. "Soon, my darling," Victoria had replied. "Once you've secured the marriage and the money, we can disappear together. The little mouse will never know what hit her." The little mouse. That's what they called me. As I read message after message, I learned the horrifying truth about my marriage. Richard had targeted me specifically because of my family's money. What he didn't know was that my parents had mortgaged everything to pay for our wedding, and there was no inheritance coming. The family wealth he thought he was marrying into was largely a facade. But Victoria's messages revealed something even more sinister. She was advising Richard on how to make me fall deeper in love with him, how to isolate me from my friends and family, and eventually how to take control of whatever assets I did have. They were planning to steal everything from me and then disappear together. The most devastating discovery came in the form of photographs. Richard had been taking pictures during our honeymoon, not the romantic shots we posed for together, but secret photos of me in compromising positions, sometimes while I was sleeping or undressing. These photos were being sent to Victoria, who responded with cruel comments about my appearance and suggestions for how Richard could manipulate me further. I sat in that hotel room, staring at the evidence of my husband's betrayal, and felt something inside me break. But alongside the heartbreak came something else. A cold, calculating anger that surprised me with its intensity. They thought I was a little mouse, did they? They thought I was naive and helpless. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. I carefully photographed every message, every photo, every piece of evidence on that secret phone. Then I put it back exactly where I had found it, in the zippered compartment of Richard's suitcase. When he returned from his phone call, I was sitting on the bed, reading a magazine, as if nothing had happened. "Everything all right, darling?" he asked, that false smile plastered on his face. "Perfect," I replied, matching his fake cheerfulness. "Just perfect." The rest of our honeymoon passed in a surreal haze. I played my part, the loving newlywed bride, while inside I was planning my revenge. I let Richard think he had fooled me completely, responding to his fake affection with what appeared to be genuine love and trust. Meanwhile, I was documenting everything, every mysterious phone call, every unexplained absence, every lie he told me. When we returned home to start our married life, I threw myself into the role of the perfect wife. I cooked elaborate meals, kept our apartment spotless, and showered Richard with attention and affection. He seemed pleased with my devotion, probably thinking his manipulation was working perfectly, but I was working too, in ways he never suspected. I had always been good with technology, a skill I had developed working as a secretary at a law firm before our marriage. Now I put those skills to use, setting up hidden cameras in our apartment and installing software on our shared computer that would track Richard's online activities. The evidence I gathered over the following months was damning. Richard was meeting Victoria regularly, sometimes in expensive hotels, sometimes at her apartment across town. They were continuing their affair with brazen confidence, secure in their belief that I was too stupid and trusting to ever discover the truth. Through the hidden cameras, I watched Richard go through my personal belongings when he thought I wasn't home, photographing important documents and searching for bank statements and financial records. He was building a complete picture of my assets, preparing for whatever scheme he and Victoria had planned. I also discovered that Victoria was not just Richard's lover, but his business partner in crime. She worked for a private investigation firm and had been using her professional resources to research my background and that of my family. They had targeted me with the precision of professional con artists, studying my habits, my weaknesses, and my social circle before Richard ever approached me at that charity fundraiser where we first met. The revelation that our entire relationship had been built on lies and manipulation should have destroyed me. Instead, it strengthened my resolve. I began to formulate a plan that would not only expose their deception, but destroy them both in the most public and humiliating way possible. My opportunity came 6 months after our wedding, just as Richard had predicted in those overheard conversations. By this time, I had amassed a mountain of evidence documenting their affair and their plot against me. I had photos, videos, text messages, financial records, and detailed logs of every lie Richard had told me. The final piece of evidence came when Richard's credit card statement arrived in the mail. As I suspected, it contained charges for the same luxury hotels where we had stayed during our honeymoon, but on different dates. The same dates when Richard had been taking those mysterious work calls and disappearing for hours at a time. The Grand Palace Resort charged on the 3rd day of our stay there for a room that wasn't ours. The Ocean View Retreat charged on the day Richard claimed to have food poisoning and spent the entire afternoon resting in our villa. The Sunset Paradise Resort charged for the suite next to ours, booked under Victoria's name. They had been together in the same hotels where Richard and I were supposed to be celebrating our new marriage. While I was waiting for my husband to return from his business calls, he was making love to another woman just rooms away from where I slept. The audacity of it, the calculated cruelty, filled me with a rage so pure and focused that it scared me. I had never felt such anger before, never imagined I was capable of the thoughts that were racing through my mind. But they had awakened something dark in me, something that demanded justice. I spent weeks planning my revenge, considering every angle, every possible outcome. I wanted to destroy them both, but I also wanted to do it in a way that would leave me legally protected and morally vindicated. The plan I eventually settled on was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. The first step was to confront Richard, but not in the way he would expect. Instead of tearfully confronting him with evidence of his affair, I would use his own arrogance and overconfidence against him. I would make him believe that I had discovered something, but not the whole truth. I would let him think he could manipulate me even further. On a Tuesday evening in November, 6 months and 2 weeks after our wedding, I prepared the stage for Richard's downfall. I had spent the day creating a special photo album, one that contained not the romantic honeymoon memories Richard expected, but a carefully curated collection of evidence that would expose him completely. When Richard came home from work that evening, I was waiting for him in the living room, the photo album in my lap. I had arranged the room carefully, candles lit, soft music playing, a bottle of his favorite wine opened and breathing. To him, it would look like a romantic evening planned by his loving wife. "Welcome home, darling," I said, standing to greet him with a kiss. He responded automatically, still playing his part in our charade of a marriage. "You're in a good mood tonight," he observed, loosening his tie. "I've been going through our honeymoon photos," I said, holding up the album. "I wanted to create something special for us, a memento of the most wonderful 2 weeks of my life." Richard's eyes lit up with what I now recognized as calculated interest rather than genuine pleasure. "That sounds lovely," he said. "Should we look at them together?" "I'd love that," I replied, patting the couch beside me. "I've put together quite a collection. I think you'll find it very revealing." We sat down together, and I opened the album to the first page. It contained genuine photos from our honeymoon, pictures of us together at the Grand Palace Resort, smiling and embracing like the happy couple we were supposed to be. Richard relaxed as he looked at these familiar images, probably thinking this was just another example of my naive romanticism. "These are beautiful, Margaret," he said, putting his arm around me. "You've done a wonderful job." "Wait until you see the rest," I replied, turning to the second page. The second page contained more photos from our honeymoon, but these were different. They were pictures I had taken secretly during our trip. Photos of Richard on his phone, disappearing for hours, returning with that secretive smile on his face. Mixed in with these were screenshots of his text messages to Victoria, printed in full color. Richard's arm tightened around me as he stared at the page, his confident smile faltering. "Margaret, what is this?" "Just keep looking, darling," I said sweetly, turning to the third page. The third page contained the hotel receipts, the ones showing charges for rooms Richard had booked for Victoria at the same hotels where we were staying. I had arranged them chronologically, creating a timeline that showed exactly when and where Richard had been cheating on me during our honeymoon. Richard was no longer pretending to smile. His face had gone pale, and I could feel tension radiating from his body. "Margaret, I can explain—" "Oh, but we're not finished yet," I interrupted, turning to the fourth page. The fourth page contained printed photographs taken from Richard's secret phone, the ones he had been sending to Victoria. But I had done something special with these photos. Using my skills with photo editing software, I had created a side-by-side comparison. On the left were the photos Richard had sent to Victoria, showing me in unflattering, vulnerable positions. On the right were beautiful, professional-looking versions of the same shots, with the difference being that I had edited Richard completely out of them. "You see," I explained calmly, "I discovered that you've been documenting our intimate moments to share with your lover. So I thought I'd create some documentation of my own." Richard was standing now, backing away from the couch, his face a mask of panic and rage. "Margaret, you don't understand." "Sit down, Richard," I said, my voice carrying a steel I had never used before. "We're not finished with the album yet." Something in my tone must have convinced him that running wasn't an option, because he slowly sat back down, though he kept his distance from me. I continued turning pages, revealing more and more evidence of his betrayal. Page 5 contained transcripts of phone conversations I had recorded, including the ones where Richard and Victoria discussed their plans for my money. Page 6 contained financial records showing how Richard had been systematically researching my family's assets. Page 7 contained background information on Victoria, including her real profession and her history of insurance fraud. But it was page 8 that truly broke Richard's composure. This page contained photos taken from the security cameras I had installed in our apartment, photos of Richard going through my belongings, photographing my documents, and making phone calls to Victoria while I was at work. "You've been watching me," he whispered, his voice hoarse with shock. "The way you've been watching me?" I replied, turning to page 9. Page 9 was the masterpiece of my collection. It contained a detailed timeline of Richard and Victoria's relationship, cross-referenced with the timeline of Richard's pursuit of me. It showed conclusively that he had been with Victoria throughout our entire courtship and marriage. But more than that, it revealed the calculated nature of their deception, the way they had studied and targeted me like predators stalking prey. "How long have you known?" Richard asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since our honeymoon," I replied. "Since the day I listened to one of your work calls and heard you telling another woman you loved her." The remaining pages of the album contained my plan for justice. I had documented every law Richard and Victoria had broken: fraud, theft, conspiracy, adultery, harassment, and a dozen others. I had prepared legal documents for divorce proceedings, including evidence that would ensure Richard received nothing in the settlement. I had contacted Victoria's employer with evidence of her misconduct, resulting in her immediate termination. But the real coup de grace was on the final page of the album. It contained copies of invitations I had sent to everyone we knew: Richard's family, his business associates, my friends and family, everyone who had attended our wedding. The invitations were for a special dinner party to be held the following Saturday evening at the same hotel where we had held our wedding reception. "What is this?" Richard asked, staring at the invitation in horror. "A party," I replied cheerfully, "a celebration of the truth. Everyone who was there to see us get married will be there to see the evidence of what our marriage really was. I've prepared a lovely presentation, complete with a slideshow of all the evidence we've just reviewed." Richard's face went through several colors, finally settling on a sickly gray. "Margaret, you can't do this. Please, let me explain. Let me make this right." "Make it right?" I repeated, closing the album and setting it aside. "Richard, you married me under false pretenses, lied to me every day of our relationship, cheated on me during our honeymoon, conspired to steal my money, and treated me like a fool. How exactly do you propose to make that right?" He dropped to his knees beside the couch, grabbing my hands with desperate strength. "I'll end it with Victoria. I'll do whatever you want. Please don't destroy me like this." I looked down at him. This man who had seemed so powerful, so confident, now reduced to begging. For a moment I almost felt sorry for him, but then I remembered the photos he had taken of me, the cruel names he and Victoria had called me, the way they had laughed about my naivety and planned to rob me blind. "Richard," I said gently, "when you married me, you promised to love, honor, and cherish me. Instead, you lied, betrayed, and humiliated me. Now it's my turn to keep a promise. I promised myself that I would make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you really are." The dinner party the following Saturday was everything I had hoped it would be and more. I had rented the same ballroom where our wedding reception had been held, complete with the same decorations and even the same caterer. As guests arrived, they were greeted by large photographs from our wedding day, creating an atmosphere of nostalgic celebration. My parents arrived early, confused by the mysterious invitation, but excited to see their daughter hosting her first major social event as a married woman. Richard's parents, Edward and Patricia Henderson, came dressed in their finest clothes, clearly expecting a pleasant evening of socializing with their new in-laws. Sarah Williams arrived with her husband Thomas, both of them looking concerned. Sarah had been asking questions about the party all week, sensing that something was wrong, but unable to get a straight answer from me. She knew me too well to believe this was just an innocent dinner party. Richard's business partners arrived in force, including his senior partner James Morrison, a distinguished man in his 60s who had been like a father to Richard. Several of Richard's clients were also in attendance, wealthy individuals who had entrusted significant real estate transactions to Richard's firm. As the guests mingled and enjoyed cocktails, I played the part of the gracious hostess, moving through the crowd with a smile and making small talk. Richard stood beside me, his face pale, but attempting to maintain his usual charm. I could see the panic in his eyes every time someone asked about the purpose of the evening. When everyone was seated for dinner, I stood up to address the crowd. The room fell silent, all eyes on me as I prepared to speak. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the room. 6 months ago, many of you were here to celebrate the beginning of Richard's and my marriage. Tonight, I wanted to gather you all again to share some things I've learned about marriage in these past 6 months. The audience smiled, expecting a heartwarming speech about newlywed bliss. Richard was gripping his wine glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. "Marriage," I continued, "is supposed to be built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. It's supposed to be a partnership where both people support and protect each other. Tonight, I want to share with you what I've discovered about the reality of my marriage." I walked to the front of the room where I had set up a large screen and projector. With the click of a remote, the screen lit up with the title slide of my presentation, "The Truth About Richard and Margaret Henderson, a 6-month review." The first slide contained a wedding photo of Richard and me, looking radiant and happy. There were murmurs of appreciation from the audience, but I could see confusion beginning to creep into some faces. "This was taken 6 months ago," I said, "on what I believed was the happiest day of my life. I thought I was marrying a man who loved me, who would be faithful to me, and who would build a life with me based on honesty and trust." The second slide contained a timeline of Richard's relationship with Victoria, starting 2 years before he ever met me. The audience gasped as they realized what they were seeing. "What I discovered," I continued, my voice steady and clear, "is that my husband has been living a double life. Throughout our courtship, our engagement, and our marriage, he has been maintaining a relationship with another woman named Victoria Ashford." Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Margaret, stop this. Please. Sit down, Richard," I said firmly. "Our guests deserve to hear the truth." The room was dead silent now, all eyes moving between Richard and me like spectators at a tennis match. I could see shock, confusion, and dawning understanding on various faces throughout the audience. I clicked to the third slide, which showed photographs of Richard and Victoria together, taken during times when Richard had told me he was working late or traveling on business. The images were damning: romantic dinners, intimate embraces, Victoria wearing jewelry I recognized as pieces Richard had claimed to have bought for me. "These photos were taken over the past year," I explained. "Well, while Richard was courting me, proposing to me, and planning our wedding, he was also maintaining this relationship with Victoria Ashford." The fourth slide contained excerpts from Richard and Victoria's text messages, with their cruel references to me as the little mouse, and their discussions about my supposed wealth. I watched as Richard's business partners and clients read these messages, their expressions shifting from confusion to disgust. "But it gets worse," I said, clicking to the next slide. "This wasn't just an affair. This was a calculated deception, designed to separate me from my money and leave me with nothing." The following slides detailed the full scope of Richard and Victoria's scheme. How Victoria had researched my background, how they had planned to isolate me from my friends and family, how they intended to take control of my assets and then disappear together. I showed the audience the evidence of their conspiracy, the photographs Richard had taken of my documents, the plans they had made for their future together. By the time I reached the slides showing Richard's hotel charges during our honeymoon, proof that he had been with Victoria in the same hotels where we were supposed to be celebrating our marriage, several people in the audience were openly weeping. My parents looked devastated, Richard's parents looked horrified, and his business associates looked disgusted. The final slide contained a simple message: "The truth sets us free." I turned to face the audience, many of whom were staring at Richard with expressions of shock and revulsion. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," I said. "I wanted you to know the truth about the man you've called friend, business partner, colleague, and son. I wanted you to understand what kind of person Richard Henderson really is." Richard finally found his voice, standing up with his hands raised defensively. "This is all taken out of context," he said, his voice cracking. Margaret is having some kind of breakdown. She's been acting irrationally. Show them the phone, Richard, I interrupted calmly. Show them the secret phone you keep hidden in your suitcase, with all the messages to Victoria. Richard's face went white as he realized I knew about the phone. The room was so quiet you could hear people breathing. James Morrison, Richard's senior partner, stood up slowly. His face was a mask of cold fury as he stared at Richard. Is this true, Richard? Have you been defrauding clients and living a double life? James, I can explain, Richard began, but Morrison held up a hand to stop him. Don't, Morrison said sharply. Don't make this worse than it already is. Pack your office tomorrow. Your partnership with this firm is terminated immediately. One by one, Richard's clients stood up and walked out without a word. His parents left last, his father pausing only long enough to look Richard in the eye and say, "You're no son of mine." When the room was finally empty, except for Richard, my parents, Sarah and me, Richard collapsed back into his chair and buried his face in his hands. "What do you want from me, Margaret?" he asked, his voice muffled and broken. "Nothing," I replied. "I want absolutely nothing from you. I've already filed for divorce. I've already moved your belongings out of our apartment. I've already closed our joint bank accounts and changed the locks. I want you to disappear from my life as completely as possible." My father, who had been silent throughout the evening, finally spoke. "You're a disgrace," he said to Richard, his voice shaking with rage. "You took advantage of my daughter's trust and kindness, and you repaid her love with lies and betrayal. If you were half the man I thought you were, you'd be ashamed to show your face in public ever again." Richard looked up at my father, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant to hurt her." "But you did hurt her," Sarah said, speaking for the first time that evening. "You hurt her in ways that will take years to heal, and you did it deliberately, calculatedly, without any regard for her feelings or her well-being." My mother, who had been crying quietly throughout the presentation, walked over to where Richard was sitting. For a moment, I thought she might offer him some kind of comfort or forgiveness. Instead, she drew back her hand and slapped him across the face with all the strength she could muster. "That's for my daughter," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "That's for the pain you've caused her, and the trust you've broken." As my family and I prepared to leave, Richard made one final desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his life. He got down on his knees in front of me, grabbing the hem of my dress as I walked past. "Margaret, please," he begged. "I know I can't make up for what I've done, but please don't destroy me completely. I'll do anything. I'll give you everything I have. Just please show me some mercy." I looked down at him, this man who had once seemed so powerful and confident, now reduced to begging on his knees in an empty ballroom. I felt no satisfaction in his humiliation, no joy in his downfall. I felt only a profound sadness for what could have been, and a deep gratitude that I had discovered the truth before it was too late. "Richard," I said softly, "mercy is something you show to someone who has made a mistake, who has acted out of weakness or desperation. What you did to me wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. It was a series of choices, made deliberately and repeatedly over more than a year. You chose to lie to me, to betray me, to conspire against me. You chose to treat me like an object to be used and discarded. You chose to mock my love and trust. Those were your choices, Richard. Now you get to live with the consequences." I gently pulled my dress free from his grasp and walked away, leaving him kneeling alone in the empty ballroom, where 6 months earlier I had believed I was beginning the happiest chapter of my life. The aftermath of that evening was swift and comprehensive. Within a week, Richard's real estate career was effectively over. Word of his deception had spread throughout the professional community, and no reputable firm would hire him. Several of his former clients filed lawsuits against him, claiming they had been defrauded. His professional license was suspended pending investigation. Victoria fared no better. Her termination from the private investigation firm had been accompanied by a review of all her previous cases, revealing a pattern of ethical violations and possible fraud. She was facing criminal charges and had lost her license as well. The relationship that she and Richard had been so eager to make public was now a source of mutual recrimination and blame. My divorce from Richard was finalized within 3 months. A remarkably quick process, given the overwhelming evidence of his misconduct. He received nothing in the settlement, no alimony, no property, no assets of any kind. The prenuptial agreement he had insisted we sign, thinking it would protect his interests, actually worked in my favor, as it contained clauses about faithfulness and honesty that he had clearly violated. But the most satisfying outcome was not Richard's professional and personal destruction. It was my own liberation. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly free. Free from the lies, free from the manipulation, free from the constant doubt and insecurity that had plagued me throughout my marriage. I moved to a new city, started a new career, and slowly began to rebuild my life. It took time to trust again, to believe that not everyone was hiding ulterior motives behind friendly smiles and loving words, but with the help of therapy, the support of my family and friends, and my own inner strength, I gradually healed from the trauma of Richard's betrayal. 5 years later, I married again, this time to a kind, honest man named David who knew my story and loved me not in spite of it, but because of how it had shaped me into a stronger, wiser person. We built a marriage based on the trust, honesty, and mutual respect that I had once thought I had with Richard, but this time it was real. David and I were married for 42 years, until his death from cancer 3 years ago. We had 2 children together, both of whom grew up knowing the importance of honesty and integrity in relationships. We had a good life, a real life, built on a foundation of genuine love and respect. Now, at 73, I look back on that terrible period of my young life with a mixture of sadness and pride. Sadness for the naive young woman who had trusted so completely, and pride for the strength she had found when that trust was shattered. The experience taught me that we are all capable of much more than we know. More love, more forgiveness, more strength, and yes, more cunning and determination when we need to protect ourselves. I never saw or spoke to Richard again after that night in the ballroom. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he eventually left town, taking a series of menial jobs and never again achieving anything close to his former success. Victoria, I was told, served 2 years in prison for fraud and then disappeared from public view entirely. I've never felt guilty about what I did to them. They made their choices just as I made mine. They chose deception, betrayal, and cruelty. I chose truth, justice, and self-preservation. The consequences of those choices shaped all our lives, but I believe they got exactly what they deserved. Sometimes people ask me if I think my response was too harsh, if I should have shown more forgiveness or mercy. My answer is always the same. Mercy is a gift that must be earned, not demanded. Richard had months to tell me the truth, months to end his affair, months to choose his real wife over his lover. He never made that choice. Instead, he continued to lie and betray until I uncovered the truth myself. What I did that night in the ballroom wasn't revenge. It was revelation. I simply showed people the truth about who Richard really was, using his own words and actions as evidence. If he was ashamed by that revelation, if his life was destroyed by it, that was a consequence of his own choices, not my actions. The photos from our honeymoon, the ones Richard thought documented his perfect deception, became the instruments of his downfall. Every image he had staged, every moment he had performed for my benefit while secretly meeting with Victoria, was turned against him. The very evidence of his success became the proof of his failure. In the end, Richard's plan to use me and discard me backfired completely. He had chosen what he thought was an easy target, a naive and trusting woman who could be manipulated and controlled. Instead, he had awakened a strength and determination in me that I hadn't known I possessed. He had turned his loving victim into his most formidable enemy. Looking back now from the perspective of 7 decades of life experience, I realize that Richard and Victoria did me a favor, though not the one they intended. They taught me that I was stronger than I had ever imagined, more resourceful than I had ever known, and more deserving of real love than I had ever believed possible. The years that followed taught me many lessons about human nature, about the masks people wear, and about the importance of trusting but verifying. I learned to read the subtle signs of deception, to listen not just to what people said, but to what they didn't say, and to pay attention to the gaps between words and actions. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that survival isn't just about enduring what happens to you. It's about how you choose to respond. Richard and Victoria thought they could write my story for me, cast me as the victim in their elaborate con game. Instead, I took control of the narrative and wrote my own ending. The community where we had lived never forgot the scandal. For years afterward, people would whisper about the Henderson affair and Margaret's revenge. Some admired my courage and cunning, while others thought I had gone too far. But their opinions didn't matter to me anymore. I had learned the difference between seeking approval and seeking justice. Sarah, my faithful friend who had tried to warn me about Richard from the beginning, remained a constant presence in my life. She often said that watching me transform from victim to victor had been one of the most inspiring things she had ever witnessed. "You found your roar," she would tell me. "You discovered that even the gentlest person has claws when cornered." And my parents, initially devastated by the revelation of Richard's betrayal, eventually came to see my response as not just justified, but necessary. My father, who had always been protective of me, said he was proud that I had learned to protect myself. My mother, who had raised me to be kind and forgiving, came to understand that sometimes kindness must be balanced with strength. The legal proceedings that followed the dinner party revelation were extensive and far-reaching. Richard's deception had tentacles that reached into every aspect of his life. The investigation into his business practices revealed that he had been using similar manipulation tactics with some of his real estate clients, particularly vulnerable widows and elderly investors who reminded him of his perception of me. Detective Martin Cruz, the investigator assigned to the case, told me that Richard's pattern of behavior suggested he was what criminal psychologists call a romantic predator, someone who specifically targets trusting individuals for financial gain. Victoria, it turned out, had been his partner in several similar schemes over the years. I wasn't their first victim, but thanks to my evidence, I would be their last. The trial, when it finally came, was a media sensation. Local newspapers covered it extensively, with headlines like "Honeymoon Hoax" and "The Bride's Revenge." I testified calmly and thoroughly, presenting my evidence methodically and without emotion. Richard's attorney tried to portray me as a vindictive woman scorned, but the overwhelming evidence made his defense impossible. Victoria attempted to blame everything on Richard, claiming she had been manipulated as much as I had. But the text messages and recorded conversations clearly showed her as an equal partner in the scheme, often the one suggesting the cruelest tactics. Her cold calculation in those messages revealed a woman devoid of empathy or conscience. During the trial, several other victims came forward. A widow named Eleanor Thornton testified that Richard had courted her before targeting me, using many of the same tactics. A divorced businesswoman named Patricia Lopez told a similar story. The pattern was clear and damning. Richard was a serial predator who had been perfecting his methods for years. The judge, Honorable Catherine Mills, was particularly harsh in her sentencing remarks. "The defendants," she said, "engaged in a cruel and calculated deception that goes beyond simple fraud. They weaponized love itself, turning what should be humanity's greatest joy into a tool for exploitation and abuse. Their actions represent a particularly vile form of emotional violence." Richard received 7 years in prison for fraud, conspiracy, and theft. Victoria received 5 years. Both were ordered to pay substantial restitution to their victims, though most of us knew we would never see that money. They had spent it all on their luxurious lifestyle and legal fees. But the real justice wasn't in their punishment. It was in the truth being told, in their exposure, in the fact that they could never hurt anyone else the way they had hurt me and their other victims. The public humiliation Richard feared so much became his reality, and it was far more effective than any prison sentence could have been. After the trial, I felt a strange sense of closure. Not the happy ending I had once dreamed of, but something perhaps more valuable. The knowledge that I had faced my worst nightmare and emerged victorious. I had been betrayed by the person I trusted most, and I had not only survived, but triumphed. The transformation I underwent during those months of investigation and revelation changed me permanently. The naive, trusting young woman who had walked down the aisle to marry Richard was gone forever, replaced by someone wiser, stronger, and more self-reliant. Some might call it a loss of innocence, but I prefer to think of it as a gaining of wisdom. My new life began slowly and carefully. I moved to a city 300 miles away, where no one knew my story unless I chose to tell it. I took a job with a women's advocacy organization, using my experience to help other victims of romantic fraud and manipulation. It was healing work, helping others navigate the same treacherous waters I had survived. It was through this work that I eventually met David, the man who would become my true husband and the love of my life. He was a volunteer at the organization, a widower whose first wife had died in a car accident. He understood loss and betrayal in his own way, and he appreciated the strength I had developed through my ordeal. David knew my entire story before we ever went on our first date. I had learned never to build a relationship on hidden truths or partial disclosures. If he couldn't accept my past, including the darker chapters, then he wasn't the right man for me. But David didn't just accept my story, he admired it. "You turned your worst experience into your greatest strength," he told me on the night he proposed, 2 years after we met. "You took something that could have destroyed you and used it to help others. That's not just survival, that's heroism." Our wedding was small and intimate, the complete opposite of my first marriage's grand spectacle. We exchanged vows in a simple ceremony, attended only by our closest family and friends, including Sarah, who cried tears of joy as she watched me promise myself to a man who truly deserved my trust. The honeymoon David and I took was everything my first honeymoon should have been. We went to a quiet cabin in the mountains, with no agenda except to enjoy each other's company and begin our life together honestly and openly. There were no mysterious phone calls, no secret meetings, no hidden agendas, just two people who had found real love after surviving their own forms of heartbreak. David and I had many conversations about my first marriage over the years. He was fascinated by the psychological aspects of Richard's manipulation and impressed by the methodical way I had gathered evidence and planned my response. "You were like a detective," he would say. "You saw the clues everyone else missed and followed them to the truth." Our children, Michael and Jennifer, grew up knowing the full story of how their parents met and why their mother was so insistent on honesty and transparency in all relationships. They understood from an early age that trust was not something to be given lightly, but once earned and properly valued, it was the foundation of all meaningful human connections. Michael became a lawyer, specializing in white-collar crime and fraud cases. He often said that my story inspired his career choice, that he wanted to help people like his mother find justice when they had been wronged. Jennifer became a therapist, working with trauma survivors and helping them rebuild their lives after betrayal and abuse. Both of my children married good, honest people who passed what Michael jokingly called the mom test, my ability to sense deception and manipulation in potential partners. David would laugh and say I had developed a sixth sense for spotting predators, a skill honed by my experience with Richard. As the years passed, the pain of Richard's betrayal faded, but the lessons I learned remained sharp and clear. I became known in our community as someone who could help when relationships went wrong, when women suspected their partners of cheating or lying. I had a reputation for being able to uncover the truth, no matter how well hidden. Sometimes people would ask me if I ever wondered what had become of Richard after his release from prison. The truth was, I had made a conscious decision not to find out. He was part of my past, a chapter that had been closed, and I had no interest in reopening it. Whatever he had made of his life after prison was his business, not mine. Victoria, I heard through the legal grapevine, had left the country after her release, possibly to avoid the civil lawsuits that were still pending against her. Like Richard, she had become a ghost from my past, someone whose fate no longer mattered to me. The photo album that had been the centerpiece of my revelation that night in the ballroom became a family artifact of sorts. My children would sometimes look through it, marveling at their mother's detective work and the methodical way I had documented Richard's deception. It served as a reminder that truth always has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply buried. But the real photos from that period, the ones I treasured, were the ones taken after the divorce, when I was rebuilding my life. Pictures of me laughing with friends, traveling alone for the first time, starting my new job, meeting David. These images told the story of rebirth, of a woman who had discovered her own strength and learned to trust herself above all others. David's death 3 years ago was devastating, but it was a clean grief, unmarked by betrayal or deception. He had been honest with me until the very end, facing his cancer diagnosis with the same straightforward courage that had characterized our entire marriage. His death left me heartbroken, but not bitter, sad, but not destroyed. At his funeral, I spoke about the difference between the love I had thought I shared with Richard and the real love I had experienced with David. True love, I said, is not about passion or romance or grand gestures. It's about truth, consistency, and the daily choice to honor and protect each other's hearts. Now, in my 70s, I live alone, but not lonely. My children visit regularly, my grandchildren call me weekly, and I maintain an active social life with friends who appreciate my direct manner and no-nonsense approach to relationships. I volunteer at the Women's Center, where I first met David, still helping victims of romantic fraud and manipulation. Sometimes, when I'm working with a new client, a woman who has just discovered that her perfect husband has been living a double life, I see my younger self in her eyes. The shock, the disbelief, the desperate hope that there might be some innocent explanation for the evidence she's uncovered. I recognize the signs because I lived them myself. To these women, I offer not just sympathy, but strategy. I teach them how to document evidence, how to protect their assets, how to plan for the confrontation that will inevitably come. Most importantly, I teach them that they are stronger than they know, more capable than they imagine, and more deserving of real love than their betrayers have led them to believe. The story I tell most often is my own, not because I enjoy reliving those painful months, but because it demonstrates that survival is possible, that justice can be achieved, and that a life can be rebuilt better and stronger than before. When women ask me how I found the courage to expose Richard so publicly, I tell them the truth. I didn't start with courage. I started with anger, and anger gave me the fuel I needed to seek justice. Anger, I tell them, is not always a destructive emotion. Sometimes it's the fire that burns away illusion and reveals truth. Sometimes it's the energy that powers change. The key is to channel it constructively, to use it as a tool rather than letting it consume you. My story has been written about in several books and articles about romantic fraud and white-collar crime. Researchers study it as an example of how victims can take control of their situations and seek justice independently. Law enforcement agencies sometimes use it as a training example, showing how civilian investigation can supplement official procedures. But I don't think of myself as a hero or a role model. I think of myself as a survivor who made the best of a terrible situation. I did what I had to do to protect myself and to ensure that Richard and Victoria couldn't hurt anyone else. The methods I used were legal, ethical, and proportionate to the harm they had caused. The most common question I'm asked is whether I think my response was too harsh, whether Richard deserved the complete destruction of his life and reputation. My answer is always the same. Richard destroyed his own life through his choices. I simply made sure that everyone knew what those choices were. Deception creates its own destruction. When you build a life on lies, that life becomes inherently unstable, ready to collapse at the first touch of truth. Richard's downfall wasn't caused by my revelation, it was caused by his decision to live a lie. My revelation simply accelerated the inevitable. The photos from our honeymoon, the ones that should have captured the joy of new love, instead became evidence of ongoing betrayal. Every smile Richard gave the camera was a lie. Every romantic pose was a performance. Every tender moment was contaminated by his secret communications with Victoria. When I arranged those photos in my album of evidence, I was simply showing the truth that had been there all along. That night in the ballroom, when I watched Richard's world crumble around him, I felt no joy, no satisfaction, no sense of victory. I felt only a profound sadness for what could have been if he had chosen truth over deception, love over manipulation, integrity over greed. But I also felt a deep sense of justice, a knowledge that the truth had finally been told and the innocent had been protected. The most important lesson I learned from that experience is that we teach people how to treat us by what we accept from them. For too long, I had accepted Richard's lies, his evasions, his disrespect. I'd made excuses for his behavior and rationalized his treatment of me. When I finally stopped accepting the unacceptable, everything changed. Now, as I approach the end of my life, I look back on that terrible period not as a tragedy, but as a turning point. It was the moment when I stopped being a victim and became a survivor. It was the moment when I discovered my own power and learned to use it wisely. It was the moment when I chose truth over comfort, justice over peace, and self-respect over false harmony. The naive young woman who walked down the aisle to marry Richard is gone forever, and I don't mourn her passing. She was replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and more authentic. Someone who learned that the greatest betrayal is the betrayal of self, and the greatest victory is the reclamation of one's own truth and power. That truth has sustained me through all the years since, through David's love and death, through raising children and building a career, through the normal joys and sorrows of a life fully lived. The strength I discovered in that hotel room, staring at evidence of my husband's betrayal, became the foundation for everything that followed. And so, at 73, I tell my story not as a cautionary tale, but as an inspiration, not as a tragedy, but as a triumph. Because sometimes, when the world tries to write your story for you, the most powerful thing you can do is take the pen and write your own ending. And sometimes, the ending you write for yourself is far better than anything others had planned for you.